Hello again. Welcome to Lam Rim, and today we're on the fifth and final session on the chapter 17, the object of negation chapter. So before we start, let's set our motivation and consider how we need to think about our sense of responsibility for ourselves and also for everybody, and adopting the Mahayana idea of cherishing all beings as we cherish ourselves, and to consider suffering of everybody as something for us to work with, to remove, to eliminate. So the best way to do that is as a Buddha, and so we establish ourselves as walking on a path to Buddhahood. And in order to do that, we engage in the six perfections. So in order to train in the six perfections, we need to understand them. And the purpose of this is to understand the sixth perfection, the perfection of insight. So that's what we're here for, to use our minds to consider and to think for ourselves whether or not this is useful, how best to adopt this into our own practice so that we can bring value to our lives. So last session we defined the term object of negation, and we also unwrapped the meaning of conceptuality in the wisdom literature according to the Middle Way tradition. And we also noted the freedoms and benefits of correct insight in the way that it gives us the ability to see more clearly the nature of Buddha Dharma. And within that also, which I could have expanded on but didn't, is the idea that as our insight develops and becomes more and more clear, so does our understanding of Buddha Dharma itself become more and more clear. There's a very strong correlation in that there. So this session, we're going to work on some of the idea of the terms or clauses used to differentiate convention from the object of negation in the context of our insight training. So this is a lot to do with the way in which we use language and how we read, how we listen, and how we teach, and how we meditate upon insight in our practice. And the purpose of this is to make it very clear to us how to say things and how not to say things, and how to prevent ourselves from getting very confused. It's quite easy to do. So that's the point there. So before I start on the text, I think it's really important to recognize that within the Middle Way school, there's a huge amount of emphasis put on to the current context, understanding the current context that we're in, and therefore also developing a mindfulness of the current context. So, for instance, if we've been asked by somebody whether or not dinosaurs truly existed, or if evolution is truly a thing, or if Buddhas are real, then it would be a complete mistake for us to say nothing is truly real, or nothing is nothing is truly anything like that, because the context of the question is conventional. So we need to be aware of the fact that the truth, the truly real, or the truly existent, or the truly existed in those cases, is being used as a phrase asking about conventional truth, not asking about the truth, ultimate truth as discovered through insight training. So similarly, if we're standing in court and we're asked to speak the truth and the whole truth, it would nothing but the truth, it would be a mistake for us to respond with nothing is essentially true. In these contexts, actual truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth, it is used within as terms within the convention. Within convention, we aren't being asked what the scope of our insight training is, and it would be just foolish to respond as if we were. So dinosaurs, evolution, Buddhas, they're not fictions, and in court we should be, we should be responsible and speak the whole truth as we've been asked to. But within the context of insight training, it would be a mistake to imagine that these things are truly real or fundamentally real or are fundamentally existent, because within the context of insight training, they are not. So it's not as if convention is a lie, conventional truths are lies, and insight training is a truth. Instead, it's and we often see like method sutras being called methods, skillful means, but that doesn't mean that they're telling white lies for those who don't understand emptiness. Truth and lies are just as dependent upon context as anything else, right? So when I'm amongst very old people, I'm called young, and when I'm among very young people, I'm called old. Neither of those is a lie. It depends totally upon the context. So skillful means determines that we recognize truth depends upon those contexts. And we should be telling the truth. We talked about telling the truth extensively in session 14, quite a while ago now. And fair enough, the Bodhisattva vow suggests that we should not be completely governed by telling the truth. But this is if we're able to recognize that when the consequential benefits of our lie will outweigh the suffering we will inflict through dishonesty, including our reputation and our integrity, which could diminish people's respect for the Dharma. So it doesn't mean that the vow doesn't mean that we might choose an easy lie over an uncomfortable truth. Anyway, so these sorts of things are important for us to recognize in terms of the context is very much relevant in terms of recognizing how we talk and what it is that we're saying. And the idea of some sort of absolutism is again falling into the idea that falling outside of the middle way school altogether. So we've got to recognize that truth and falsity depend very much on context for our understanding. So Rinpoche describes how the teachers, the great teachers of the insight tradition, use adverbs to adverbs like intrinsically, essentially, substantially, truly, all of these independently, right? In sentences. So, like, if it were the case that this blue mug essentially existed, right? Or equivalent. So they use equivalent phrases such as if this mug existed by way of its own character, or as I said a while ago, like if it appears to exist on its own, floating around in space, or exists on its own side, if it did exist on its own side. So this sort of way. So he tells us these terms are used to indicate that the cup, the mug in this case, or the entity being discussed, exists. It says, it does exist. The verb to be is also used rather than just exist. So much say is rather than exists. But the context, within the context of insight training, the existence of an object is only conventional, or merely conventional, if we prefer. And the adverbs like essentially or truly and so on, which are used with the if or in the case of appears to be, then this is establishing that we're talking about the far more powerful mode of existence in which the entity appears to exist for us in light of our innate ignorance. So when our ignorance is put into case, we see an object floating around in space on its own, and that there is the if that we're talking about. So the appearance of it having an essential existence, or having an intrinsic existence. So if it were to exist intrinsically, then there would be a whole lot of consequences. And this is exactly what Rinpoche is saying. So we can use these adverbs essentially when we are differentiating. This is within the insight training. We use these to differentiate between the way in which we see things appearing due to our innate ignorance and the way in which things are conventionally. So when we were talking about the mug, we can talk about the mug absolutely fine, no problem at all. The blue mug's here. And it exists. It exists as a convention. It exists as a designation, right? But the point about it is it appears to exist, self-exist in its own way, in its own nature, floating on its own side. In that sense, that would be what we would call essentially existent or objectively existent, and so on. And that's where we use the adverbs objectively, essentially, substantially, intrinsically, independently, all those sorts of things. So, in summary, these adverbs, essentially, and so on, describe aspects of the mistaken quality or mode of existence that we give the entities when we apprehend them while being ignorant. So it's because of our ignorance that we see them as being independent, essential, externally intrinsic, all those sorts of things. Yeah. So these terms, these adverbs, we can call them as qualifications or qualifying terms. So I'm going to try and use the phrase qualifying term whenever I'm talking about essentially these adverbs, right? So that they're used within insight training for us to distinguish between when we're talking about the mere existence of something and the apparent existence of something, driven by ignorance. In other words, the distinction between the cup which exists and the object of negation which appears to be a truly existent cup. So these qualifying terms describe the object of negation rather than the object. So Rinpoche points out that sometimes in the sutras, such as the Heart Sutra, and occasionally by the early masters, such as Nagarjuna, we might occasionally see statements that say things like there is no blue mug, or no consciousness, or no death. These sorts of things like that, and no form, right? Zubme, and so on. So it's important for us to recognize the context, in other words, insight training, so that we can gloss those sentences to the intended meaning. Gloss just means we're able to actually fill it out because there's an implicit adverb being used there, an implicit qualifying term being used there. So we then know that what we're really saying is it doesn't mean there's no mug, it means there's no essentially existent mug as appears to our ignorant mind. So although we'll see it saying, such and such does not exist, in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases in these texts, when it is missing, and it's quite rare in the later texts, then we understand, we need to understand that there is a hidden adverb there, if you like. And again, we're just being clarity time. I'm repeating myself a lot. These assertions do not mean that things do not exist at all. It means they don't exist as we see them. And again, as I mentioned in the prior session, if we start thinking that no mug means there's no mug there, then this is a mistake. This is also an ignorant mistake based upon this idea of some sort of dualism, which is just as ignorant as believing that there is something present. And this is known as annihilation. So we can talk about the annihilation of the mug as saying there's nothing. If you say there's no mug there is no mug whatsoever, then this is an annihilation. So when we are fixated with the idea of a dichotomy, that things either truly exist or they truly don't exist, we completely miss a very, very simple point. We have to consider the context, and then we can determine within that context whether a thing exists or not. So as soon as we remember that a mug exists only within a certain context, then we're free from that dichotomy completely. So it's recognizing that the existence and non-existence as terms, as phrases, only make sense within a context, as do true and false. So recognizing that they're contextually dependent gives us a huge amount more insight into recognizing how they don't have to be one thing or another outside of any context. It doesn't make any sense. Because otherwise it's like me saying, well, I'm either young or I'm old. It doesn't matter who I'm with, right? So we need to think about the context in order to recognize its mode. So in brief, then we need to say this mug does exist, and that's a true statement. It exists, but it exists conventionally, and this blue mug does not inherently exist is also truth, both within both of these sentences, within the insight training, So yes, it exists. It exists conventionally, and it does not inherently exist is also true. So if we said this mug does not exist and this mug does exist, and which we'll find sometimes people feeling is commentators, modern commentators on Nagarjuna say, this shows he doesn't believe in truth. It's just all confused. It's like, no, this is completely mistaken. The point is, he's saying is the way it does exist is a convention. How it doesn't exist is how our ignorance perceives it to appear, and this is the point. So the qualifying term is inherently, and that can switch from it being an existent into it being something that does not exist, because it has that quality of not being inherent. Right. So this is how we can see whether or not we're talking about it from the point of view of convention or the point of view of ignorance. So there's if we think about this mug does exist and this mug does not inherently exist, then it's easy for us to recognize that it's the inherently part, the adverb there, which serves its purpose as a qualifier to indicate that we're referring to the blue mug as it appears to mind, inflicted by innate ignorance, and therefore it does not exist that way. It's just how it appears to exist due to our innate ignorance. So like in the Heart Sutra, we have something that says, and depending on the translation, there is no attainment of wisdom. So similarly, bearing in mind the context, which is insight training, and recognizing that the adverb is implicit, being an early sutra, we can read that the sutra is actually telling us the way in which our ignorance paints the existence of wisdom, the existence of wisdom, which is the subject of the text, is not how wisdom exists. It merely exists, we know it merely exists as a designation or a convention. And importantly, that doesn't mean that it is a fiction. We definitely experience the consequences of wisdom. It just doesn't mean that it exists beyond the context in which it is used. So we're not talking about the object, we're talking about the way in which we perceive the object. And this is very, very important, is to recognize that existence, the whole idea of existence, comes from our perception. It doesn't have anything to do with what is there beyond us. So then Rinpoche wants to make to be clear about saying, what about when we're talking about non-existent things rather than just existent things? So clearly, when we've made the ability to distinguish the use of these qualifying terms when we're talking about objects, in order to make it clear what aspect we're actually looking at. But there are plenty of things which don't exist at all, such as the antlers of a rabbit, or an essence, or a creator god, or the tiny unicorn that lives in this room, right? They're not really suitable subjects for qualifying terms. And why is that? Because they already don't exist. If a tiny unicorn running around this room doesn't exist, there's no point in saying that it doesn't essentially exist, right? Or that it's not inherently existent. It's completely redundant. It doesn't exist. So in general, in insight training, Rinpoche says we really are strongly, in fact, and not just Rinpoche, but also Chandra Curtis says, we're strongly discouraged from using qualifying terms for non-existent objects. And in fact, it implies that we're not able to differentiate between existent things and non-existent things. So if we say, yeah, this mug doesn't inherently exist, then that's clear what we're talking about. If I say the unicorn running around this room doesn't inherently exist, it makes it sound like that the unicorn has some sort of conventional existence similar to the blue mug, which it does not. So if we're not able to differentiate between the conventional existence and conventional non-existence, such as the mug and the unicorn, then we're going to be very lost indeed. So we've got to really be clear about what exists conventionally and what does not exist conventionally. Remember, we're talking about context as well. And the clauses serve the purpose differentiating between how things merely exist and how they appear to exist in a very different way due to innate ignorance. So in general, when we're talking about something which we can recognize as non-existent, it's not appropriate for us to sort of say innately or inherently or essentially and so on. However, so there are some sort of clauses here. We are prone to fantasy. We often half believe that our fantasies might manifest, right? We can easily spend hours wasted on wondering how we're going to spend the winnings of the lottery ticket that we haven't even bought, right? So, or wondering what will happen after the imaginary bandit has killed us, oh, what's going to happen? So these beliefs or these sort of fantasies can be so strong that in those cases it might be easier for us to recognize that these sort of could be, might be, would be possible futures that we are fantasizing about don't essentially exist. Okay, actually they don't exist at all. We can look into our own past, and whatever anticipations we have had in the past, and we think about ones which have eventuated, which have happened, we can see that things never turned out as we imagined they would. Right, so this huge amount of energy we put into thinking, oh, what's it going to be like? We don't know what it's going to be like until it happens, and then we'll find out, oh, it's just like everything else most of the time anyway. So this sort of aspect of it is like, yeah, it can be useful for us to say essentially exists, this, because that might help us rather than recognize that actually don't exist at all. So there are other exceptions too. For instance, Rinpoche mentions as if we're helping somebody to understand insight who has strong convictions about some things existing, such as, let's say, God, a creator God existing, it might be useful in order to help them through their ignorance to actually not try to challenge them on their convictions, but to say, well, God also doesn't inherently exist. So normally we wouldn't say that, right? But because it's like, well, God is non-existent. But if we're talking to somebody or a student who has a very strong belief in God, then we'd say, okay, well, God also is not inherently existent. So at that point, it's like we need to, again, consider even the context of the situation for us to think about how best to recognize or bring meaning to these terms. So in general, though, following Buddha's behavior, I think we really generally work to talk to others within the context and boundaries of their own conventions, their own beliefs, their own convictions. So it's far more appropriate and according to my teachers too, to inspire someone to follow their own path correctly, rather than to try to persuade them to accept emptiness and so on. Emptiness generally is one of those areas which is very, very much Buddhist. A couple of other Indian traditions has something very similar, but in general is like there's no value whatsoever in trying to explain emptiness to somebody who's a strong Christian or whatever, or has a strong faith, because it's not going to be of any benefit to them. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that it's a lie or whatever. It's just it's not appropriate. There are far better things, far better ways in which we can talk within their own context, within their own beliefs, which can be far more useful to us. And in fact, often that allows for us to be inspired through some of the practices that they do, without us feeling any need to adopt some of the views which we differ from. So in general, Mahayana Buddhism, especially Madhyamaka, Middle Way Buddhism, prefers to generate inspiration rather than to convert or evangelize. And it's because of this we must understand the apparent arguments against other schools of thought that we find in the texts and commentaries. They're not critical of either of the schools or of their advocates. The points are made because it's easy for us to follow similar patterns of thought found in those schools and which are not suitable for us in terms of our development of insight using the middle way training. So it doesn't mean that they're not suitable for advocates of those schools or they're not suitable for other purpose. Otherwise, we'd be accused of reducing these points to something sort of equivalent to claiming that, our school is better than their school. And this is very much like saying strawberry ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream. And some of us will agree with that, and some of us will disagree with that. So, so the point is that we have to think about the context and the capabilities and the interests and the surroundings and the backgrounds and everything else to determine what's a suitable path for a suitable individual at a suitable time. It's not like there's one true faith or one true path or one true tradition within Buddhism, let alone anything else. So because we don't hold on to and again I've said this repeatedly, because not holding on to objectively established truth doesn't mean there are no truths, or that there are no Buddhas, or there's no path. It's not some sort of great big mishmash. That's not the point. It's not sort of like plural point of view. But the point is that we need to recognize that there are many paths within Buddhism to point out that the object of negation is not present. Right, the middle way, school, the Madhyamaka is one. It's very, very powerful, very useful, very appealing to modern mind. But it's certainly not the only one, and it's certainly not the only one that works. There are others that work just as well. All we have to do is to establish the object of negation is not present. So saying one school is better than another without any sort of qualification is a complete denial of the need to identify the context and the circumstances of the situation. So what we understand is to say, let's look at what there is rather than try to differentiate on some sort of objective metric. But most of the time it's like saying, is this suitable for me? I should do it. I should practice it. Right, that's our choice, and we've our journey. The whole point about achieving Buddhahood is because we recognize that where we are now isn't going to do very much good. We have to conquer our own demons. We have to remove our own flaws, and then we can actually begin to do some good. So the idea that saying, oh yeah, you're not, you're on a lower school from the one in which I'm on, is sort of completely missing the point. It's not like chocolate ice cream. It really isn't. It's sort of like saying, okay, well, I'm an Arsenal fan and you're a Chelsea fan, so it's like it doesn't help. The point is to say, we've chosen a school, or we choose a school, we choose a training, and then we follow that training through. We've got to be humble. We've got to recognize other people have other journeys to make, and we do our best to help them in whatever we can, rather than just persuade them that they're smaller than us, or that they're inferior, or that we're doing something. That's just rubbish. Anyway, you know it's true, right? So it's not important. Going back to the text, right? So when we think about to ourselves, or when we're discussing with others who have chosen the path, this path, Madhyamaka path of insight, it's both messy and unnecessary to say that non-existent things are inherently non-existent. Okay, so normally we don't want to do that. Basically, it's not right to say something like the human soul does not inherently exist. Yeah, except in situations like me right now sharing Lam Rim with you, showing how it is a mistake. Obviously, then it's like, okay, so in this case, I'm saying it because I'm saying what we shouldn't be saying, right? So when we misapply these qualifying phrases or qualifying terms, we're blurring the edge in our own minds between what exists and what does not exist. And it also means we don't really necessarily understand why we're using those qualifying terms, which is deliberately to differentiate between conventional truth and the existence that our ignorant mind sort of overlays across everything. So again, Rinpoche says that when we're refuting the mode of existence that our ignorance brings to the party, then we should always qualify that the non-existence we're talking about is that. So we should always use a qualifying phrase, qualifying term. So in that sense, he says, well, even though the sutras and the early masters didn't always do it, we really should, because otherwise it again becomes very confusing for us to recognize the distinction between what it is that we're talking about. So again, he's saying, it's not a good idea for us to say the blue mug does not exist, for the reason that it blurs our understanding of the meaning. And we're not saying it doesn't exist. We're saying it doesn't exist inherently. So say it. We should say it, right? Now, there are times, even modern times, when, especially in the heat of discussion or whatever, and when one's repeating again and again and again, one might say it doesn't really exist, and it just isn't there. And at that point, it's like, well, actually, that should have been qualified. And normally, then, in those cases, we need to look at the where that has already been mentioned several times by the person teaching. But as a general rule, in terms of practice, is better for us in terms of our own meditation internally, in terms of our communication, also to think, use the qualifying term when we're talking about what our ignorance is presenting. So rather than saying the blue mug doesn't exist, better to say it doesn't inherently exist, it doesn't truly exist, or it doesn't exist in the manner that our ignorance would make it appear to exist, these sorts of things. It's not hard. We're not really here to, what we're trying to do is not establish rules of language except for the purpose for us to be able to identify the object of negation clearly and to eliminate it. So when we do that, this is primarily looking at the way in which we talk to ourselves or talk to others or teach or share, is just to be really, really clear not to make these mistakes in terms of the way in which we use these terms. In most of the time, our energy is spent in meditating on emptiness is to do with eliminating that which we impose, right? That's what the emptiness is, the emptiness of its inherent self. The lack of, the absence of the object to be negated, which is this is superimposition by our ignorance. So this sort of thing here primarily is our main exercise. But Rinpoche has given this time at the end of the chapter to looking at the way in which we should talk about it and listen to it and read it and understand it when we see it being written, what's being talked about. So it's not hard. Essentially, the point about saying, it doesn't inherently exist versus it doesn't exist is big. Obviously, it exists, but it just doesn't exist there in a way that it exists on its own. It exists in dependence upon our designation or in dependence upon convention. And similarly, so, we recognize that the true self or the soul or the ghost or the essence within ourselves or that we imagine to be there, it does not exist at all. But we're still here, right? So separating out what is from what is not is absolutely relevant to us and very important. Just distinguishing between the imaginary mode of existence that ignorance gives us and the conventional mode of existence that we need to live in is important. None of the lines of reasoning we use through the analysis that we use in the middle way tradition will do any damage whatsoever to conventional existence. But it will destroy, if we think about it carefully, we actually follow those thoughts through, it will destroy any concept of inherent existence that we have. Now, obviously, there are subtle innate layers going on there that we will still jump to because we're so conditioned by it. But we will begin to break that down as we understand it, following the lines of reasoning that we discussed, I think, 2 sessions ago, for instance. So Rinpoche's gone on about this quite a bit here, and I think maybe he seems to be getting quite hot under the collar, as you say, at this point. And we've made it several times before, but I think maybe when he was teaching it, some of his students had sort of their attentions had drifted a bit. But he's hammering home the point. Anyway, he says it's a mistake not to recognize the ability for us to establish what is right and wrong. It's a mistake for us not to be able to differentiate between a good narrative and a poor one, certainly within the scope of a given context. He points out that the Madhyamaka has this distinguishing feature from other schools, which is that it allows all the different presentations of Buddha Dharma without exception, because it recognizes conventionality, because it recognizes context. Right, so it recognizes the circumstances, and these things here allows our school to recognize the needs and the views of the audience as being a determining factor regarding what it is that is said and how it is said and what is being said. Now, as to whether or not it really is a distinguishing feature, that's a question I wouldn't want to go down, but certainly I'm very happy and content with the fact that the middle way school, Madhyamaka, does allow for this and does recognize this. It seems to make a lot of sense. And again, this demonstrates really one of the qualities I was saying about the middle way tradition is it's not a philosophy. It's an understanding, it's a single understanding about the way in which our ignorance grasps, holds on to things. It cuts through that. So he says, look, these qualifying terms, he says, Chandrakirti more or less always uses one. He says we can find occasional instances where he's missed it out, but that's after he's been repeating himself, or he's already established it earlier on. He says, and Nagarjuna often sort of says, the mug does not inherently exist, and then later on he'll say it does not exist because of this or that. In other words, he's kept the qualifier in following sentences as a part of the argument. So, and sometimes he does it the other way around. So it says it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because it's inherently, it doesn't exist inherently. So this is generally possibly to keep one, to keep the listener like, ooh, how is this working? Sort of a shock value or a way of bringing the listener in. And sometimes he sort of says, there's Nagarjuna, Rinpoche saying, sometimes Nagarjuna will say, such and such, like say, the mug does not exist inherently. And then he'll say, it doesn't exist like this. And then the mind doesn't exist like this, and elephants don't exist like this. And so again, it's like we have to recognize that he's transferred the adverb, the inherently, over into the other subjects that are being discussed in the same argument. So what Rinpoche saying is within Nagarjuna's text that although he doesn't always qualify in a sort of thorough way, every single time, in a almost redundant way, and he sometimes does it back to front to back, one can almost always find in every case that Nagarjuna does include a qualifying phrase. But I sort of wonder if Rinpoche isn't sort of suggesting that had he been more consistent with using the qualifying phrase, there would have been far less misinterpretations of his text. I mean, he does defend the intention of not being excessive in using the qualifications. It can be a really rather boring to say, this doesn't inherently exist, it doesn't inherently exist like this, and so on. But he also does admit it's not always easy to recognize when the qualification should be included within Nagarjuna's work, and also that many have made mistakes when reading this text. So it does sort of say, well, maybe Nagarjuna could have been a little bit more explicit, and in that way maybe there would have been far less confusion as to what it was he was intending to say. Rinpoche also points out that the Indian masters especially will say when analyzed it does not exist, and using this as a qualification, he says this itself does need actually to be made clear that it means it does not exist essentially. And again, this is in light of having read many commentaries where people confuse or conflate what is the subject of analysis and what is destroyed through that analysis, so that there are commentators contemporaneous with Je Rinpoche who are saying, look, nothing exists because everything is destroyed by analysis because of the way in which they're reading these particular texts. So anyway, so in order to back Je Rinpoche's argument and to demonstrate the phrases that were being talked about in terms of essential existence, he cites from Chandrakirti's own commentary on the 400 verses of Aradeva, when the fire of analysis burns them, they can be nothing other than essenceless. So what he's saying is, when we're doing this, when analyzed response, and he says, so this shows that while the objects of analysis, remain, they do so without any essence. And so the point is that therefore this, he feels, demonstrates completely that we must understand that when analyzed it does not exist means that what we're eliminating is the essence, or that it does not exist essentially. Okay. So there's a very nice part of this, which is Chandrakirti talks about how something is deceptive, and one of the examples he gives, similes he gives, is like the wheel of a firebrand. This is like, I don't know, when I was little, I used to do circles with sparklers, and it would look like there's a circle there, and it would feel that there is actually a circle there. But of course, in the end, if you were to use a high-speed film or whatever, we'd recognize, in fact, it's just the way in which our perception creates a circle from the movement of the light. This sort of an afterburn on our retina creates the idea that there's a circle there when there really isn't. So now Rinpoche moves on to discuss the qualification ultimate. So we've really dealt with essentially, inherently, and so on. And now there's sort of some special attention given to the word ultimately or ultimate when we're differentiating convention from the object of negation. So if we've been following, listening over the last few sessions, it should be pretty clear by now that from the position of the middle way tradition, even conventionally, the true self is a complete fabrication, just as is the imaginary snake that we might impute upon a hose pipe, right? So just to remember that the object of negation we're talking about, it refers to the entity as ignorance imagines it, not the mere entity which exists. Yeah, so it's the object of negation is the snake that we put onto the hose pipe, not the hose pipe. Likewise, it's the idea that there's a spirit or a ghost or a soul or a being inside within this sort of collection of blood and bones that is the Ben, that is the me. That there is the snake. Doesn't exist, according to middle way tradition, is not present at all in any way. And in principle, the point is that ultimately we can use it exactly the same way as we use other qualifying terms. So the following sentences mean the same, right? When we're talking about how conventions are non-inherent, the blue mug does not essentially exist. The blue mug does not ultimately exist. The self does not exist ultimately. The self does not exist intrinsically, right? And when we're talking about how inherent is non-existence, we can say the inherent self does not exist and the self does not ultimately exist. So these are synonyms. They all mean the same. Obviously, I'm not saying the self and the blue mug are the same, but we're talking about the rest of the sentence. Okay. So why is it Rinpoche spent quite a large section on distinguishing between ultimate and ultimately from the other terms when they're more or less used exactly the same way? And the answer is because when he was writing this, there's quite a bit of confusion as to whether or not the terms should be applied in a different manner. And the history of this is not possibly not directly relevant to our practice, but I think actually there is a point to be made which is completely relevant to our practice. And it certainly shines a huge amount of light on how easy it is for us to get confused and why Rinpoche spent so much time talking about using adverb qualifications like ultimately and so on, and recognizing how they're used. So going back a bit in time, there was a renowned Indian middle way scholar, a Madhyamaka author called Baba Viveka. Baba Viveka is one of the authors that Rinpoche relies upon. And he came after, I think quite some time after Buddha Palita, who's another one of the Indian scholars who we've cited a lot from. But Baba Viveka came before Chandrakirti. Now, he was well known and he was highly reputed for his thoughts on the middle way tradition. But even so, Chandrakirti made some points about Baba Viveka's texts, and just to point out every now and then which parts should be treated with care. So some people took this to be a complete differentiation of schools of thought, that this is that there's a separation of the middle way school into what's known as the Svatrantika and then the Prasangika, and we'll be going into that in some detail later on. But essentially, the idea is that there was this sort of complete scrap between Chandrakirti and Baba Viveka. But I think actually, Chandrakirti had a huge amount of respect for Baba Viveka. He only wanted to really point out some difficulties in Baba Viveka's presentation. But this is my opinion. There are others, and I think what's important for us is not to get bogged down in scholarly debate at all. Anyway, needless to say, many scholars got involved, and many scholars subsequent to Chandrakirti got involved. And by the time the tradition had reached Tibet, it was like another century or so, there was plenty of literature on it. And by the time Lama Tsongkhapa was studying, the Tibetans had also published many of their thoughts on this. Now, Rinpoche studied a huge amount, especially of the Middle Way school texts. Maybe not every, but many, if not most. And he saw there were some strange ideas floating around. And one view, which was very popular in his day, was that the followers of Chandrakirti, in other words, who bought into what Chandrakirti was saying, do not use the word ultimately as a qualifying term. So they were saying that if we're following Chandrakirti, we wouldn't say that the blue mug does not inherently ultimately exist. Now, I've just said that we do, right? So this is a view that he disagreed with. So we'll go into, but he said also these people said that while the followers of Chandrakirti do not use ultimately as a qualifying term, the followers of Bhava Viveka do. And I think it's I think that because there is this differentiation about how the followers of Bhava Viveka say, we talk about ultimately, and how the followers of Chandrakirti don't, and because it's a very, very common view, a differentiation created by the Tibetan scholars in Lama Tsongkhapa's day, I think he gives some time to it to say, let's get this cleared up. So I'm doing my best to share us the Lam Rim Chenmo, which was written in published in 1402 or something. So this might be less directly relevant to us, but I still think there's something of value to us right now. So anyway, Rinpoche's like, listened to this, read this, heard this, was given teachings on this, and he was like, no, this is not right. He gives many, and in this text here, he gives many citations from the Prajnaparamita, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Buddhapalita, and Chandrakirti, are all recognized as followers of the Chandrakirti as being definitive sources. And all of these citations use the word ultimately as a qualifying terms, such as they do not exist in an ultimate sense, which is found in Nagarjuna's Precious Garden. So this sort of thing is they all use, also they use like in reality or similar synonyms to ultimately. Therefore, he points out, there's no ground for imagining that the followers of Chandrakirti do not or should not use the word ultimately as a qualifying term. He says there's no reason why we should not be able to say ultimately it's not such and such. Conventionally, it is such and such. So he says that it's a completely spurious aspect of Tibetan scholarship. But he does more than that. He explains in quite a straightforward manner how this matter arose, and directly, and this is where I believe how it relates to us in our practice of insight. So Bhava Viveka was writing a commentary on Nagarjuna's statement, which is there is no production from self. So no production from self is another way of talking about self-causation. So self-arisen, self-caused. And but Bhava Viveka says, as a commentary, says things are not produced from self ultimately because for existing, for example, a living being. So in fact, as I understand it, Nagarjuna is saying that nothing produces itself from itself. Self-causation is a non-existent. It is only found in some religions, possibly some philosophies, and such as the idea that a god, brings himself or herself into existence, so it's self-caused. So here, Bhava Viveka has made the error that we've just been talking about, which is he unnecessarily applies a qualifying term to a non-existent self-causation, right? So he says self-causation doesn't ultimately exist. It doesn't exist. And it is just like saying unicorns, the unicorn running around this room doesn't inherently exist. It's not relevant, it's just confusing. And so doing so, there is the other aspect of this, which is when we only use the term inherently referring to existent objects, in other words, conventional truths, then the implication is that self-causation exists conventionally. And Je Rinpoche suggests that it's this case that actually Bhava Viveka seems to appear to suggest that essential natures do exist conventionally, which definitely is different from what we understand, or certainly from what we've been taught. But I think that what Bhava Viveka, and again, I'm not a scholar, this is just how I understand it, his view might have been a bit more subtle than it appears. It might not have been that he was saying that these non-existent things exist conventionally, but it could be that what he's saying, that there's, as a perception of an essence itself is a perception, and perception is the driver of convention and designation, then to deny that perception existence, conventional existence, would be a mistake. And I might be wrong, but many of us do find it difficult we struggle to differentiate between these things. Things that we imagine or that we know of as being sort of fictional, if you like, or mythical, and those things that exist. For instance, the unicorn running around this room, right? Or a unicorn. Doesn't have to be the one running around this room. We know what a unicorn looks like. We imagine them to have some sort of mammal with a horn, with a twisty horn and lots of mane, and rather like a small horse, or sort of tend to be very white. But they don't exist. Not one sort of single atom in the universe was ever part of a living unicorn. Now, fictional stories exist, and in those stories, unicorns sometimes happen to be there, but that doesn't establish unicorns as existence. It just establishes that there are fictional stories. Anyway, regardless of all of this discussion, Rinpoche reminds us that Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti both consider ultimate to be an appropriate qualifying term when being applied to those things that do exist conventionally. The question is whether Bhava Viveka feels that the term is also appropriate to non-existence, or if he considers some subset of non-existence to exist conventionally. So that's another, or whether or not he actually he considers non-existence in general to be to exist conventionally. So that would be an aspect. So for us, though, going back into our practice, we should have no difficulty in seeing ultimately as a qualifying term and being able to use it when we are differentiating between ultimate existence and conventional existence. The point above is, to me, and the whole point about this story about Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti and how all of this swathe of scholars and meditators and practitioners and teachers after that discussion demonstrates how even a small slip in our writing or in our talk can lead to a very large and lasting effect. So this is the point, is that we do need to be aware of just especially how important it is to get our terms right. So, and lastly, Rinpoche just wants to qualify that when we're talking about ultimately, what are we really talking about there? What does ultimate mean, sort of finally or fundamentally? But he says, there are lots of different meanings to ultimate. We need to recognize which particular one we're actually using in this case. And essentially what we're saying is that the way things naturally are beyond all awareness of any sort, and it is also reported to be directly and experientially accessible to Buddhas who are completely free of ignorance. But Rinpoche points out, he says, going beyond, rather than worrying about what Buddhas perceive or don't perceive, it's also available to us in terms at a conceptual level when we experientially recognize the falsity of the mode of existence that our innate ignorance presents to us. So this is the point, is essentially, while we can spend a lot of time sort of thinking about how some of this is beyond us, in fact, if we can develop our insight experientially in terms of recognize within ourselves how we perceive things, and cut it, knock it a bit. Even without being great meditators or great practitioners, we can substantially shift and change the way our perceptions are based. And when we do that, we begin to let go of some of those concrete fixations that we have, and this strong grasping as to us being here in a particular way. So I think that's enough for this chapter. Next session we'll go on to looking at some of the Rinpoche's dedicated, I think, 3 chapters to some of the distinctions, historic distinctions between Svatrantika and Prasangika, both of them parts of the Middle Way tradition. And I'll do my very best to keep it useful for us in terms of our own practice in insight. But up until then, let's dedicate any benefit from today, from this session, towards destroying our ignorance, freeing our minds from the fetters of ignorance, such that we may improve our practice and continue to work towards our goal of benefiting all beings through achieving Buddhahood. Okay, so thank you so much for listening, and hopefully we'll virtually meet again in the next session. Until then, let's just sit for a short amount of time.